Before the glory, before the blood, before the war cries, what did it really mean to be a warrior in the medieval world? What was life like for the men who fought and died without ever tasting the sweet fiction of a knight's honour? For most, the path to war began not with a trumpet's call, but with hunger. The fields that fed their families were also the grounds that bred soldiers. Boys learned early that strength meant survival. Their hands, calloused from turning soil, would one day grip the haft of a spear or the worn hilt of a sword. War, to them, was not a destiny, it was an inevitability. The lords and kings who owned the land also owned their loyalty. When banners were raised, refusal meant death or disgrace. So they marched, not as heroes, but as extensions of another man's will. Training was crude. A wooden stick, a shield of bark, perhaps a rusted blade passed down through generations. There were no shining suits of armour or polished war horses waiting in the stables. The common warrior fought with what he had or what he could steal. He learned to strike fast, to shield his face, and to run when he must. Every scar was a lesson, every wound, a story carved into the flesh that proved he had lived through one more day. In the villages, talk of glory spread like smoke, curling from the hearths of those who'd never seen battle. But among the men who had, silence lingered. They spoke little of what they'd done, and even less of what they'd seen. The songs of valour that echoed through the halls of nobility were hollow to them. They knew that honour, more often than not, was a word spoken by those who never bled. Still, there was a strange pride, a belief that to fight was to belong. In a world bound by duty, the sword gave purpose. It transformed nameless men into instruments of fate, even if only for a fleeting moment. For the peasant who had known only toil, the battlefield offered a dark kind of equality. Under the rain of arrows and the clash of steel, titles meant little. Death, at least, did not discriminate. But before that moment, before the march, before the blood, the nights were restless. Men lay awake beneath coarse wool blankets, staring at the wooden beams above them, wondering if they would ever see home again. They thought of wives, of mothers, of children who might never remember their faces. Some whispered prayers, others stared into the darkness, trying to make peace with what awaited them beyond dawn's light. Because every warrior, no matter how hardened, felt the same chill when the horn first sounded. Beneath the armour, or the rags, was a man trembling between fear and duty, trapped in the narrow space between life and legend. And as the world turned toward war, that trembling would soon give way to something else entirely, something that changed them forever. What drove men to face death, knowing they may never return to their families? Was it honour, or was it something far darker, something that no one talks about in the history books? For most, the answer was painfully simple. They fought because they had to. The medieval world left little room for choice. When the Lord's messenger rode into the village, his voice carried the weight of law. "By order of the crown," he would say, and that was that. Refusal meant punishment, loss of land, imprisonment, even death. So men gathered what little they had, kissed their families goodbye, and marched beneath banners that bore names of kings they'd never met. Honour, as the poets spoke of it, was a luxury of the wealthy. For the peasant, war was survival disguised as duty. He fought not for pride, but to keep his home from burning, his family from starving. When the harvest failed or taxes grew unbearable, the sword became both weapon and livelihood. A man who could fight might earn bread, coin, or if fortune favoured him a scrap of land to call his own. War, in its brutal way, was the only path out of the mud. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something more haunting. Some men fought because they feared what peace would bring. In times of quiet, hunger returned, debts grew, and the same lords who demanded courage in battle demanded payment at home. On the field, at least, death was honest. It came swiftly, without judgment. Religion, too, played its part. The church promised forgiveness to those who died in service of their Lord or in the name of God. Priests would bless their swords, tell them they were instruments of divine justice. For some, that was enough to steady the trembling in their hands. For others, it was a hollow comfort, a mask for the guilt that would follow, because no prayer could wash away the image of a man's eyes dimming in the dirt. In the quiet before battle, soldiers wrestled with their conscience. They told themselves they fought for their people, for safety, for faith. But deep down, many knew the truth. It was fear that guided their steps. Fear of hunger, fear of shame, fear of what would happen if they didn't obey. And so, they convinced themselves that courage was simply the art of marching despite that fear. When dawn broke and the horns echoed across the valley, they stood shoulder to shoulder, hearts pounding beneath leather and mail. Around them, banners fluttered in the cold wind like fragile promises. Some whispered prayers, others cursed softly under their breath. But all of them, in that fragile moment before the charge, understood one thing. Survival was the only honor that mattered. And soon, they would learn what that struggle truly cost when the ideals of duty and faith collided with the blood-soaked earth of the battlefield itself. Imagine standing in the midst of chaos, where death doesn't come in noble duels but from 1,000 unseen hands. How did soldiers survive the absolute terror that gripped the battlefield? The truth of medieval warfare was far from the ballads sung in candlelit halls. The battlefield was a living nightmare, an open wound where men faced not only their enemies, but the breaking point of their own minds. When the horns sounded, and the ground began to tremble under the march of thousands, the air itself seemed to change. The morning mist, once soft and silent, turned thick with fear. You could smell the iron of weapons before you even saw them. You could taste the dread on your tongue. For many soldiers, the first moments were the worst. The waiting, the endless, torturous stillness before the clash. The sound of armor creaking, men whispering last prayers, horses stamping nervously. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown to something unthinkable. When the enemy appeared over the ridge, a mass of bodies, armor glinting like shards of the sun, it no longer felt like a fight between men. It felt like the world itself was preparing to tear apart. Then came the roar. Arrows screamed through the air, vanishing into the mass of men ahead. Some struck shields with dull thuds, others found flesh. You could hear the sudden, strangled cries, the ones who never even saw their killer. And in that moment, the order of battle dissolved into chaos. Lines broke, formations scattered, and men became animals. The ground quickly turned slick beneath their boots, not with rain, but with blood. It clung to everything: clothing, weapons, hands. The smell was unbearable: sweat, dirt, iron, and the stench of fear. It filled the lungs, choked the throat, made the mind swim. Every swing of a sword demanded everything: strength, precision, and the will to keep going, even as friends fell beside you. But the true enemy was not always the man across the field. It was the terror inside the rising panic that whispered that you would be next. Many froze in place, unable to move, their minds blank with horror. Others fought like madmen, consumed by adrenaline, unaware of the wounds that would later claim them. The line between bravery and insanity was thin, often invisible. To survive such a storm required more than strength. It required surrender, not to the enemy, but to the chaos itself. The men who lived learned to quiet their minds, to focus on rhythm, the swing of the blade, the step forward, the breath between screams. They became mechanical, almost detached. Not heroes, not killers, just survivors. When victory finally came, it brought no joy, only silence, the kind that presses on the ears until it feels like punishment. The battlefield after combat was a place no song could ever describe. Bodies lay tangled in grotesque stillness, faces twisted in fear, eyes wide open to a sky that no longer seemed divine. The crows came first, then the flies, then the men with torches to burn what was left. Some soldiers wandered through it all, searching for friends among the dead. Others sat down and wept, unable to move. A few began to laugh, a hollow, broken sound that frightened even the living. These were men who had crossed a threshold few could ever return from. The mind did not leave that place easily. Long after the battle ended, soldiers would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding as if they were still there. The sound of clashing steel, the scream of dying horses, the crack of bones, it all lingered. Some became wanderers, unable to settle, haunted by the faces they had seen. Others turned to drink, or to silence, trying to bury memories that refused to stay dead. And yet, the world around them celebrated. Lords held feasts, priests gave thanks, poets sang of victory. But the men who had fought knew that every toast, every cheer, was built on the quiet suffering of those who could no longer speak. The scars they carried were invisible to most, but inside, they bled still. Even religion, the comfort that once promised salvation, began to waver. Many questioned the idea of divine purpose. How could heaven watch and say nothing? Others clung more tightly to faith, desperate for meaning in what they'd endured. But whether believer or skeptic, all shared one truth. Once a man had seen the battlefield, he was never the same. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. Before, they were men of duty, fathers, sons, farmers, hunters. After, they were something else stripped of illusion, marked by a quiet understanding of life's fragility. They no longer feared death in the same way. Some even longed for it, seeing in it a kind of release from memory. There are few written accounts that capture what truly happened in the minds of those men. The Chronicles of Kings spoke of battles won, of lands taken, of glory earned. But between those lines, in the unspoken spaces, lay the truth, that every victory was written in madness and despair. Imagine standing there, after it was done, the sun setting over a field of the fallen, the silence stretching endlessly. You look down at your own hands, trembling, stained red. The blade you hold feels heavier than before, as if it knows what it has done. Around you, the world is quiet again, but inside, the storm has only just begun. That was the true battlefield, not the clash of swords, but the war within the human heart. And as armies rose and fell through centuries, commanders began to understand that this inner war, the breaking of the mind, could be as powerful as any weapon forged in steel. What came next was not just a fight for territory or survival. It was a deliberate strategy to exploit the very fear that lived inside every soldier's soul. The battlefield, once a test of strength, became a theatre of manipulation, where victory was often decided before the first blade was ever drawn. What if the battles weren't just about strength, but about precision, positioning, and the manipulation of fear? What if every soldier on the battlefield was a piece in a deadly game of chess, moved not by his own will, but by the unseen hand of strategy? Behind the chaos and blood, medieval warfare was a careful balance of logic and brutality. For the men who fought, survival often depended not on courage, but on where they stood, when they moved, and who stood beside them. Every formation, every command, every step taken across the muddy earth was part of a grander design one most soldiers never fully understood. At the heart of many armies was the shield wall, a living fortress of wood, metal, and human endurance. Shoulder to shoulder, men locked their shields together, transforming themselves into a solid mass of defense. The wall moved as one breathing, groaning, advancing. Each man depended entirely on the next. A single gap could mean death. The wall was not built of shields alone, but of trust. And yet, within that trust was a terrifying vulnerability. If one faltered, all could fall. Behind or beside them came the spearmen, their weapons thrust forward like a forest of iron. They jabbed, stabbed, and prodded into the space between shields, unseen faces striking at unseen enemies. To the soldier inside the formation, the world narrowed to sound the clash of steel, the cries of pain, the shouted commands that barely pierced the din. It was order born from chaos, and chaos barely held at bay by order. For commanders watching from the ridge, the battlefield was something else entirely. It was a map of moving parts, of timing and deception. To them, soldiers were pieces, pawns, and knights in a game that demanded sacrifice. They studied the terrain, the wind, the light. A battle could be won by the rise of the sun behind an army's back, or the thickness of the mud beneath an enemy's feet. The greatest generals knew how to use fear itself as a weapon, how to make a line of men believe they were already defeated before the first charge began. Cavalry were the hammer to the infantry's anvil. Clad in chain and plate, mounted knights thundered across fields like living storms. The sight alone could shatter weaker troops. The noise of hooves, 1,000 heartbeats pounding the ground, was enough to unmake the resolve of any man not ready to die. But cavalry charges were precise instruments, not wild assaults. The best commanders waited for the exact moment when the enemy line began to waver, then sent their riders in, striking the faltering heart like lightning. Archers, too, were tacticians of death. From the edges of the field they rained down volleys that darkened the sky. The sound of arrows was unlike any other, a hiss that grew into a roar, then silence, then screams. Archers were often despised by knights, yet their role was vital. They softened the enemy's will before the true carnage began. And in the rhythm of their shooting draw, release, draw again, there was an eerie calm, a mechanical precision amid the madness. For the common soldier, these strategies were invisible. He did not see the shape of the battle, only the man in front of him. He did not know the grand plan, only that he must hold the line until ordered otherwise. When commanders signaled retreat or charge, it was not courage that drove him, it was instinct, drilled discipline, and the desperate will to live. Every move on the battlefield was a calculation. When to advance, when to feign weakness, when to sacrifice. Victories were often measured not by who fought hardest, but by who thought fastest. And yet, in the grand tapestry of tactics, one truth remained: those who fought at the bottom bore the heaviest cost. They were the expendable rhythm that made strategy possible, the nameless force behind a commander's triumph. And when the dust settled and the maps were drawn, their lives were already forgotten numbers in a ledger of victory. But the ground remembered. It always did. Because beneath every strategy, every clever maneuver, lay the same grim reality, that no amount of planning could prepare a man for what the next moment would bring. The art of war was only ever as perfect as the chaos it tried to control, and that chaos would soon reveal its most brutal face. How would it feel to be on the receiving end of a sword strike, knowing that a single blow could end your life or change it forever? What was it like to wield these instruments of death, each one designed for destruction? Every weapon on the medieval battlefield told a story not of honor, but of efficiency. Each was crafted with one purpose: to end life as swiftly or as brutally as possible. For those who wielded them, weapons were not symbols of glory but extensions of survival itself. The sword, often romanticized in legend, was a rare luxury. A knight's blade was not the weapon of every man, it was the mark of status, forged from tempered steel and shaped with care. Balanced and elegant, a well-made sword could slice through armor joints, or sever a limb with terrifying precision. Yet despite its beauty, it was not merciful. In close combat, the sword was intimate. To strike, a man had to look into the eyes of the one he killed. Many soldiers described that gaze as the hardest part, the moment when battle became personal, when myth dissolved into the trembling horror of reality. The peasant soldier, however, rarely held such craftsmanship. His weapon was crude: a spear, a pitchfork, a club reinforced with iron. Spears were the great equalizers of medieval warfare, long, simple, and deadly. From a distance, they could stop a horse mid-charge, piercing through flesh and bone. Up close, they became awkward, desperate tools, often broken and reused until little remained but splintered wood and rusted points. Axes, on the other hand, carried a unique kind of terror. They were born not from the forge of a warrior, but from the hands of labourers. The same tool that felled trees could just as easily split skulls. Heavy and uneven, axes did not cut cleanly, they crushed. A single swing could cleave through armour, or leave wounds so deep that no healer could hope to mend them. Those who survived such blows were often left disfigured, their bodies marked forever by the weight of the weapon that struck them. Then there was the mace, a cruel invention of metal and intent. Designed to crush rather than cut, it cared little for armour. Helmets, bones, and shields all gave way beneath its force. The sound of a mace striking its mark was said to echo differently than any other weapon. A dull, wet thud that silenced men mid-breath. To wield it required strength, but also a certain numbness, a disconnection from what it meant to destroy. For archers, death came from a distance. The longbow was a masterpiece of physics and patience, able to send arrows whistling hundreds of yards into packed formations. The archer did not see the faces of his victims. He loosed his arrows in arcs, trusting the sky to deliver them. But the screams that followed, the sight of men collapsing in waves, reminded him that his reach was not without consequence. Arrows pierced armour, lodged in ribs, and shattered spines. Some men bled for hours before dying. Others were dragged from the field with shafts still embedded, their bodies trembling with pain. Crossbows, slower but more powerful, added another layer of dread. A single bolt could penetrate plate armour, turning even the most elite knight into flesh and blood once more. For this reason, the Church once condemned their use, calling them instruments too cruel for Christian warfare. Yet they persisted, for cruelty often proved the most effective teacher in the art of war. Even the simplest tools carried their own horror. Knives used for eating became weapons in desperate hands. Hammers, farming sickles, broken blades all found their place on the battlefield. In war, ingenuity was born from desperation. And behind every weapon stood a craftsman, often nameless, shaping iron and wood into tools of death. Their work demanded precision, but their hearts could not remain untouched. Each hammer strike in the forge echoed the same question that haunted the men who fought. How much suffering can be shaped by human hands? The weapons of medieval combat were not merely tools, they were reflections of the age itself, harsh, practical, and merciless. Every cut, every crushed bone, every arrow loosed into the air spoke of a world where life was fragile and death was an art. But what these weapons did to flesh was only part of the story. The greater horror was what they did to the men who used them, the slow unmaking of the human spirit beneath the weight of what their hands had done. And on the battlefield, that price would soon be paid in full. What happens to a body after it has been struck by a sword? How did soldiers live with wounds that would make modern medical professionals cringe? On the medieval battlefield, death was not always swift. For many, it came slowly, cruelly, and in pieces. The body, designed for endurance, was pushed beyond its limits. Bones shattered under the weight of hammers and maces, flesh tore like cloth beneath blades. The air, thick with dust and iron, carried not only the sound of battle but the screams of men learning how long a body could last before it finally gave up. A sword strike rarely killed instantly. More often, it mangled. Blades sliced deep but not always clean, leaving ragged wounds that poured blood faster than anyone could stop it. A man might fight on for a few minutes, clutching at his side as warmth drained from him. Some fell quietly, others screamed until their voices broke. Those who survived the first blows were not always the lucky ones. Spears and arrows left a different kind of agony. When a shaft pierced the body, it often stayed lodged within. To remove it meant tearing through muscle, sometimes opening veins that would never close again. Soldiers knew the cruel irony. Pull it out and you might die faster. Leave it in, an infection would finish what the blade began. The smell of gangrene, rotting flesh and decay became a familiar stench in every camp. Crushing weapons were even more merciless. A mace or warhammer did not always draw blood, it broke what lay beneath. Ribs snapped inward, puncturing lungs. Skulls cracked like pottery, leaving the brain bruised and swelling in silence. Some victims staggered for hours after the blow, eyes glassy, their minds already slipping away. Others never woke again, their faces frozen in twisted stillness. Then came the disembowelments, the worst of all. A cut to the belly spilled a man's insides into the dirt, a sight so horrific that even hardened soldiers turned away. Those struck down in such a way rarely died immediately. Some crawled, trying to hold themselves together, whispering for help that would never come. Others lay still, watching the clouds above as life seeped slowly from their bodies. But for every death on the field, there were dozens who lived just long enough to face another kind of torment: survival. In the aftermath of battle, the wounded lay scattered like broken dolls. The lucky ones were carried back to camp, though healing was a word that meant something different then. There were no anesthetics, no sterile tools. Surgeons, often barbers by trade, worked with what they had: knives, saws, and fire. Amputations were common. A limb too mangled to save was cut away without hesitation, the wound cauterized with hot iron to stop the bleeding. The air filled with the smell of burning flesh, and the sound of men biting down on leather to keep from screaming. Blood loss claimed many, infection more still. The smallest wound could fester into fever within days. Without clean water or proper bandages, pus gathered beneath scabs, and limbs swelled until the skin split. Surgeons might slice open the wound to let out the poison, but more often than not, it was already too late. Sepsis crept silently, turning skin pale, breath shallow. Death came quietly in the night, mistaken for sleep. Those who did recover bore scars that never truly healed. Missing fingers, twisted limbs, half-blind eyes, these were the marks of survival. Pain followed them everywhere. In winter, the cold bit into old wounds like a memory. In dreams, they felt again the sharpness of steel, the crushing weight of impact. Their bodies became chronicles of every battle fought, every injury endured. And then there were the invisible wounds, the ones that medicine could not touch. Men who had survived began to tremble at sudden noises, to wake drenched in sweat, convinced they were back on the field. Some spoke to ghosts, others to no one at all. The body might mend, but the mind often refused. Healing, such as it was, depended on wealth. Knights and nobles had physicians who could stitch, cleanse, and pray over wounds. Peasants relied on superstition herbs, charms, and desperate hope. A poultice of garlic and wine might keep infection at bay, or it might only delay the inevitable. Prayer, at times, felt like the only medicine left. Even among the living, survival was rarely celebrated. A man who returned from battle was changed. His gait slowed, his hands shook. He carried not only scars but a sense of guilt for those who hadn't returned, for those who had died screaming beside him. In the eyes of the world, he was a survivor, but inside, he was a fragment. For medieval soldiers, every wound told a story, a reminder that war did not simply kill, it consumed. Flesh, bone, and spirit all paid the price. And yet, when the next call to arms came, they marched again. Some did it for duty, some for coin, and others because they no longer knew what life was without the sound of war. The body could be mended, stitched, and bound, but what it endured left an imprint that no healer could erase. The battlefield may have ended with silence, but inside the survivors, the pain never truly stopped. And as they limped home from the carnage, carrying the weight of both victory and loss, they brought with them not triumph but the memory of what it meant to suffer, to survive, and to be human in a world that had long forgotten mercy. Because when the wounds faded and the battles ended, the war inside them was only just beginning. What happens when the battle is over, but the true pain begins? How did medieval warriors survive wounds that would have killed men in modern times? For those who lived through the chaos of battle, survival was only the beginning of another, slower war one fought not against enemies, but against their own bodies. When the shouting ceased and the smoke lifted, the battlefield revealed its grim harvest. The wounded, scattered among the dead. They groaned in the mud, clutching torn limbs and split flesh, praying that someone would find them before the carrion birds did. Medieval medicine had little to offer them. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and no understanding of infection. Treatment began where the fighting ended on blood-stained ground, with trembling hands and crude tools. Men called surgeons were often barbers by trade, more accustomed to cutting hair than closing wounds. Yet, in the absence of better options, they became healers by necessity. They worked with knives, boiling water, and fire. Their art was one of endurance, not comfort. A soldier with a deep cut might have his wound washed with vinegar or wine if such luxuries were available to cleanse the flesh. But more often, the injury was wrapped in dirty cloth, and prayers replaced medicine. The stench of blood and rot hung thick over the makeshift tents that served as infirmaries. Flies gathered in clouds, feeding on open wounds. Fever was common, and so was death. Those who survived the first few days faced the long ordeal of recovery. A broken bone might be set with splints made from sticks or bits of armour. Missing limbs were cauterized with hot irons, the hiss of burning flesh echoing louder than the patient's screams. There was no anesthesia, only belts of leather to bite down on, and perhaps a mug of ale to dull the senses. Many fainted from pain, some never woke again. Amputation was the most common cure for infected wounds. A soldier's mangled arm or leg would be tied with a rope to slow the bleeding. Then, with a single brutal cut, the limb was removed. The stump was burned to seal the veins. Infection often followed anyway, but for some, the crude surgery was the only chance at survival. Those who lived learned to balance on crutches, to swing a weapon one-handed, or to beg when they could no longer fight. Even smaller injuries could become fatal over time. A splintered bone, an untreated arrow wound, a minor cut infected by dirt all could bring down the strongest warrior. Without proper healing, wounds reopened again and again. Scar tissue formed unevenly, twisting limbs and tightening skin until movement became agony. Soldiers carried these reminders for the rest of their lives. A limp that never faded, a hand that no longer closed, an eye clouded with infection. And yet, some did heal, if healing could be called that. They learned to adapt, to move differently, to live in constant pain. The lucky few who returned home brought their scars with them like silent badges. To their families, they were heroes. But inside, they knew the cost of every scar was not pride. It was pain, remembered with every step, every breath. Healing was never certain, and neither was survival. The line between life and death blurred in the weeks after battle. Some men seemed to recover. only to die suddenly when fever returned. Others lingered for months, drifting in and out of delirium. The body fought, but the odds were cruelly stacked against it. And yet, the human will to survive endured. Soldiers clung to life through agony, believing that if they could just see one more dawn, perhaps the suffering would fade. But for most, the pain did not end with recovery. It merely changed form. The body might mend, but the spirit was left raw and uncertain. Because once the wounds closed and the fever broke, another kind of healing would begin, one that no blade or poultice could touch. The kind that haunted the mind long after the body was whole. What if the true horrors of war weren't the injuries, but the psychological scars that never healed? How did medieval warriors cope with trauma when the very idea of mental health didn't exist? For many who survived the battlefield, the war did not end when the swords were sheathed. It lingered quietly, mercilessly in their minds. The clash of steel and the screams of dying men replayed in dreams, echoing through the darkness long after the fighting was done. But in a world that saw pain as weakness and silence as strength, these invisible wounds were rarely spoken of. Medieval chroniclers wrote of men who lost their senses after battle, who wandered aimlessly or sat for hours staring into nothing. They were described as cursed, possessed, or simply broken by God's will. No one called it trauma, no one could, yet their symptoms were unmistakable. Nightmares that tore men from sleep, cold sweats, sudden fits of rage or fear, the inability to stand the sight of blood again. All of it, the same pattern we now recognize as the aftershocks of unbearable stress. Some soldiers returned home unable to bear the noise of village life. The laughter of children, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, even the barking of a dog could send them spiraling into panic. Others grew detached, speaking little, wandering into the woods for days at a time. They were men trapped in two worlds, the present they could not connect to, and the past they could not escape. Their families often didn't understand. How could they? To those who had never seen war, a man's silence seemed like stubbornness, a sudden outburst like madness. Many soldiers withdrew completely, their faces haunted by images too vivid to forget. Some took to drink, numbing the memories that refused to fade. Others turned violent, their tempers sharpened by fear they couldn't explain. In some chronicles, these men were said to be touched by battle, as if war itself had claimed their souls. Religion offered both comfort and confusion. Priests told them to pray, to confess, to seek forgiveness for the lives they had taken. Yet prayer did not silence the screams in their dreams, nor did confession erase the guilt that burned inside. Many began to believe that what haunted them was punishment, that God had cursed them for surviving when better men had fallen. The church spoke of divine justice, but for the broken soldier, it felt like divine abandonment. Night brought the worst of it. When the world grew quiet, the mind filled the silence with memories. The faces of the dead, the smell of blood and smoke, the sound of a dying man calling for his mother all returned as vividly as the day they happened. Some would wake in terror, gripping their blankets as if they were shields. Others would not sleep at all, staring at the fire until dawn, afraid of what dreams might bring. Society had little patience for these men. A warrior's worth was measured in courage, not confession. Admitting fear or weakness was seen as shameful, so they buried their pain beneath layers of silence. Some joined new wars, seeking to drown old memories in fresh violence. Others became mercenaries, drawn to the only life that made sense anymore, the chaos they both feared and understood. But even among their comrades, few spoke openly. A soldier might notice the trembling hands of the man beside him, the faraway look in his eyes. They understood without words, sharing glances that said, "Asterisk, I see it too. Asterisk." Yet the next morning, they would march on, pretending nothing was wrong. In this way, entire generations of warriors carried their trauma like unseen armor, heavy, unrelenting, and invisible to those who hadn't worn it themselves. For some, the burden became too great. Medieval records mention suicides, men who took their own lives out of despair or guilt. The church condemned such acts, declaring their souls lost. But perhaps these men were simply trying to escape the endless battle raging inside them. We call it PTSD now. They had no name for it, but they knew its weight. They felt it in their sleepless nights, their shaking hands, their empty stares. It was the war that never ended, the quiet one, fought in the mind. And as these soldiers struggled to rebuild themselves, their pain rippled outward. Their silence, their anger, their sorrow, all of it seeped into the very fabric of the villages they returned to. Because the scars of war did not belong to one man alone. They belonged to the world that sent him to fight and then forgot how to bring him home. What happens when a warrior returns home, but his body is broken and his mind is scarred? How did society treat those who fought, when all they had to offer was war? For many soldiers, the return from battle was not a triumph. It was a quiet descent into a life that no longer felt like theirs. The battlefield had stripped them of their innocence, and peace demanded something they no longer possessed. When they crossed the threshold of their homes, the world they once knew had changed, or perhaps it was they who had changed beyond recognition. Villages that had once felt alive now seemed distant, almost fragile. The laughter of children, the rhythm of hammers, the songs at the tavern, all of it sounded muted, unreal. To the soldier, the calm felt wrong. After months of chaos, silence became unbearable. The mind searched for the sound of marching feet, for the clang of weapons, for something to fill the void. Peace was not comfort, it was confusion. Those who bore visible wounds became walking reminders of the cost of war. Missing limbs, blinded eyes, twisted scars all marked them as survivors, but also as men apart. Some were pitied, others were feared. Children stared. Farmers crossed the road rather than meet their gaze. The war hero of one season became the beggar of the next, sitting at the edges of marketplaces, trading stories for bread. A few were rewarded, though even those rewards carried a cruel irony. Knights might receive land or titles, but with them came responsibilities they were ill-equipped to bear. The fields they now owned demanded labour their broken bodies could no longer give. The peasants who fought for coin or protection rarely received either. Once their usefulness ended, so did the lord's concern. Letters of commendation, promises of pay, all too often vanished with the smoke of victory feasts. And yet, despite the hardships, many soldiers longed for the world they'd left behind. They wanted to believe they could belong again. But how does one return to sowing fields after wielding a sword? The hands that once struck down men could no longer hold a plough without shaking. The eyes that had watched comrades die could not easily look upon simple joys without guilt. Families, too, struggled with the return. Wives who had waited faithfully found husbands who were no longer the men they remembered. Some returned distant and cold, others haunted and restless. There were moments of tenderness, yes, but also of silence so heavy it became its own kind of grief. Many marriages withered beneath the weight of what could not be spoken. Children grew wary of fathers who flinched at thunder or stared blankly into the fire. The church told them to give thanks, to pray, to confess. But prayer could not erase the smell of burning flesh that still lingered in memory. Confession could not unsee what had been seen. In truth, forgiveness, divine or otherwise, was hard to find. The same hands that had been blessed for battle were now expected to live gently, to labour, to worship, to forget. Some soldiers could not. They drifted, seeking new wars to fight, new causes to give meaning to the violence within. Others became mercenaries, their loyalty sold to whoever offered coin. A few turned to crime, their sense of morality fractured beyond repair. The world called them outlaws, but in truth, they were simply men who had forgotten how to live without war. Medieval society had no word for trauma, no understanding of reintegration. It was a time that valued survival, not healing. The warrior was celebrated in song only when he was far away, fighting someone else's war. When he came home, when he became real, with scars and sorrow, the world did not know what to do with him. And so, many lived in the spaces between two lives. One remembered, one endured. They became ghosts in their own homes, wandering through days that no longer fit them. The sword, once an extension of their purpose, now hung rusting on the wall, a relic of something both proud and painful. For those who survived, peace was not an end. It was a reminder, a quiet, relentless echo of everything they had done and lost. They had gone to war believing they would fight for their lords, their land, their God. But when they returned, they discovered the cruelest truth of all, that war never truly ended. It simply changed its shape, following them home in silence. And in that silence, as villages rebuilt and kingdoms rose anew, The memory of the warrior lingered an unseen scar on the face of a world that was already preparing for the next battle. How did the endless cycle of war shape the very fabric of medieval life? What did it cost society to live in a world where the sword ruled above all else? In the medieval world, war was not an event, it was a condition of existence. Every generation was touched by it, every field scarred by it, every prayer whispered in its shadow. To live in this age was to live within a structure built on violence, where peace was not the norm, but a brief pause between conflicts. And from this ceaseless rhythm of blood and duty, the shape of an entire civilization emerged. Feudalism, the cornerstone of medieval life, was born from the necessity of war. Kings needed armies, and armies needed loyalty. In exchange for land and protection, vassals pledged their swords to their lords. Every manor, every castle, every village was part of this vast web of obligation, a system that ensured a ruler's survival through the promise of defense. The peasant worked the soil not only to feed his family, but to sustain the warriors who fought in his lord's name. Even the most distant farmer, who never saw a battlefield, was bound to it by duty and tax. The economy, too, was shaped by war. Weapons, armour and horses became as valuable as gold. Blacksmiths forged blades as often as ploughs. Trade routes opened and closed with the tides of conquest. Entire towns grew rich from supplying armies, while others were burned to ash in their wake. The cost of constant conflict drained kingdoms of wealth and people alike. Taxes rose, harvests dwindled, and yet the drums of war never ceased. For rulers, victory was not enough. Survival demanded that wars be fought again and again, each one feeding the machinery of power. Religion, in turn, wove itself into the fabric of warfare. The church sanctified battle, declaring that those who fought in God's name could find salvation through the sword. Crusades turned faith into a rallying cry, transforming spiritual devotion into political force. Priests blessed armies before they marched, and relics were carried into battle as divine shields. Yet this sacred justification also deepened the wound. It blurred the line between holiness and horror. The same hand that offered communion in peace could offer absolution for killing in war. Culturally, the glorification of war seeped into art, music, and story. Ballads sang of noble knights and chivalric deeds, but those songs often disguised the cruelty behind the myth. Children grew up hearing tales of valor that rarely matched reality. For them, war was not an aberration, it was destiny. To live and die by the sword was both admired and expected. It became a language of identity, a way to measure worth in a world that prized courage above compassion. Yet beneath the armour of ideals, society bore the weight of exhaustion. Peasants who survived raids rebuilt their homes again and again, knowing destruction would return. Widows and orphans filled the villages, silent casualties of conflicts they never chose. The nobility grew powerful through war, but that power was built on suffering, a pyramid of bodies that upheld the illusion of order. In truth, medieval society was not merely shaped by war, it was sustained by it. The threat of invasion justified kings, the need for defense justified loyalty, and fear justified obedience. Even peace itself was often enforced by the promise of violence. The sword hung always above the world, gleaming like judgment. And yet, in that unending struggle, humanity adapted. From the ashes of conquest rose castles, cities, and alliances that would one day form nations. The very systems of governance, trade, and faith that defined Europe were forged in the fires of war. But as weapons evolved and walls rose higher, the machinery of conflict grew more complex and more devastating. For war was not content to shape society alone. It sought to reshape the tools of creation themselves, bending human ingenuity toward destruction. And so, from the blood-soaked fields of the medieval age, a new kind of progress began. One built, not from peace, but from the relentless pursuit of a stronger way to kill. What happens when war pushes humanity to innovate? How did the horrors of the battlefield lead to some of the most significant technological advancements of the Middle Ages? For all its destruction, war has always been one of humanity's greatest engines of invention. In the medieval world, necessity and survival were the sparks that set progress aflame. Each generation faced the same question: how to strike harder, defend longer, and die less often. From this relentless pursuit of advantage, entire leaps in engineering, craftsmanship, and tactics were born, transforming not just how battles were fought, but how societies were built. The earliest innovation of the medieval battlefield was not the sword or the armor, it was organization. As armies grew larger, commanders learned that chaos was death. They studied how to move men like parts of a living machine, how to break an enemy's line with precision rather than fury. From this discipline came formations like the phalanx and the shield wall, tactical marvels that required unity, rhythm, and trust. The medieval soldier was not just a fighter, he was a cog in a calculated design. But as strategies evolved, so too did the weapons that defined them. The longbow, simple in form yet devastating in power, changed the very balance of war. Crafted from yew and trained into muscle memory from childhood, a skilled archer could loose arrows faster and farther than ever before. In battles like Crécy and Agincourt, common archers shattered the myth of the invincible knight. Armor that had once been a symbol of superiority now became a target, its gleaming surface no match for the piercing force of a well-aimed shaft. The response to this new threat came swiftly. Armorers began to experiment, thickening steel plates, shaping them to deflect rather than absorb. Chainmail, though flexible, gave way to plate armor, an art form in itself. The knight became a walking fortress, each suit custom-made to balance mobility and protection. Yet with every improvement came new vulnerabilities. Armor grew heavier, slowing movement. Horses required stronger barding to bear the load. In time, the cost of a single knight's equipment rivaled that of a small farm, deepening the divide between the warrior elite and the common soldier. Meanwhile, the world of siege warfare became a theatre of ingenuity. Castles, those symbols of medieval power, forced inventors to think on a grander scale. Engineers devised towering trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds across impossible distances. The thunderous crash of a boulder against a castle wall was both a weapon and a message. No fortress was truly safe. From these machines of destruction came advances in counterweight mechanics and architecture, knowledge that would later shape the construction of cathedrals, bridges, and cities. The age also witnessed the rise of fortifications that reflected the very nature of human fear. Walls grew thicker, moats deeper, towers higher. Every improvement in a fence was mirrored by a new layer of defense. The spiral of innovation became endless, a medieval arms race where imagination and terror marched hand in hand. Yet not all advancements came from noble halls. Peasant ingenuity played its part. The crossbow, dismissed by knights as dishonourable, became the weapon of common men who sought to level the field. It required little training, yet its bolts could pierce plate armour with ease. So feared was the weapon that the Church declared its use against Christians a sin. Still, it spread across Europe like wildfire, redefining warfare from the ground up. By the late Middle Ages, whispers of a new invention began to circulate, a weapon born not from strength or skill, but from alchemy and fire. Gunpowder, arriving from the east, would soon change everything. Crude cannons and handguns appeared, unreliable yet unstoppable in their potential. With each thunderous blast, the old world trembled. The knight's age was ending. The sword, the symbol of chivalry and control, was slowly giving way to smoke and powder, to a kind of killing that felt less personal, but far more final. War had driven men to master physics, metallurgy, and mechanics long before science had a name. What began as tools of destruction became the foundations of progress. Bridges built from siege knowledge, clockwork born from the gears of catapults, cities designed with defensive walls that later became their hearts. In the medieval struggle for dominance, innovation was the truest victor. But if war shaped the body of progress, it also haunted its soul. For every new weapon forged, for every wall raised higher, humanity was forced to look at what it had become, a species forever improving the art of destruction. And that shadow, that legacy of ingenuity born from blood, would linger long after the smoke cleared, echoing not just through the battlefield, but through the stories, fears, and imaginations of those who lived in its wake. What happens when the truth of war is lost to history? How did the legends of medieval warfare distort the brutal realities and shape the way we see the past today? The medieval world did not only fight its wars with swords and fire, it fought them again in words, stories, and song. From the ashes of battle rose myths so enduring that they outlived the men who inspired them. In these retellings, the mud and blood of the battlefield were replaced by glory and gold. The screams of the dying became the anthems of heroes. War was rewritten, purified by memory, reshaped into legend. It began with the minstrels and chroniclers, those who stitched history into poetry. They sang of knights who fought for love and God, of noble kings who waged righteous wars, of valour that transcended death itself. The truth was far less elegant, but truth rarely inspired loyalty. The peasant who had seen his village burned, the soldier who had watched his brother fall, they were not the audience these tales sought to comfort. These stories were meant for courts and cathedrals, for those who needed to believe that war had purpose, that death on the battlefield was a kind of salvation. The church, too, played its role in shaping these myths. From pulpits and parchment, priests declared that war could be holy, that blood spilled in God's name washed away sin. Crusaders marched under banners embroidered with crosses, convinced they carried divine justice. Behind their faith burned the promise of eternal glory, a story that made slaughter seem sacred. It was easier to fight when one believed heaven watched with approval. But beneath the sermons and songs, the dead still lay silent in the fields, their truth swallowed by the narrative of righteousness. In literature, the myth of the knight became the beating heart of an entire age. Tales like Times, the Song of Roland Times, and Times Le Morte d'Arthur, Times painted warfare as a test of virtue rather than survival. Knights were cast as paragons of courage, their duels reflections of divine will. Chivalry became both armour and illusion, a code that demanded nobility even as it justified killing. The more violent the world became, the more desperate its storytellers were to frame that violence as noble. Artists followed suit. Tapestries depicted battles as pageants, filled with bright banners and shining armour. Painters rendered scenes of crusades not as carnage but as holy procession. Even death was stylized, martyrs and warriors alike shone serene, their faces calm as if they had found peace in destruction. These images filled the halls of castles and churches, reinforcing the illusion that war was not chaos but destiny. Yet outside those walls the reality remained. The survivors, the maimed, the broken, the forgotten rarely appeared in these works. Their suffering was inconvenient, their silence easier to ignore. History was written by those who needed to believe that their world was righteous. The stories that endured were not the cries of the wounded, but the verses of the victorious. Still, myths have power, and in time, they began to shape not just memory, but identity. Young men grew up dreaming of the heroes they'd heard sung about, chasing a version of war that never truly existed. Entire generations marched into new battles, under the illusion that courage alone could conquer fear. The cycle continued, each war birthing new stories that glorified the last. And as centuries passed, the romantic vision of the medieval knight hardened into something timeless. Even today, the armour gleams brighter in memory than it ever did in life. The idea of the noble warrior, honourable, disciplined, fearless, still echoes in our movies, our games, our imaginations. We forget that the same legends that inspired courage also erased the truth. The real legacy of medieval warfare was not just in the castles that remain, or the weapons in museums. It was in the stories that outlasted both. Tales that turned suffering into spectacle, that taught people to see beauty in blood and meaning in violence. The myths were never meant to deceive. They were born from the need to make sense of what could not be understood. But the question remains, when we look back on those shining knights and heroic battles, are we seeing history, or the stories that history wanted us to believe? Because even now, centuries later, we still walk in the shadow of those legends, still drawn to the same illusions, still mistaking myth for memory. And in that reflection, the medieval world whispers softly, the war never truly ended, it simply changed its form, living on in the tales we continue to tell. How does a medieval knight's tale still shape the way we view modern soldiers? Why does the glorification of battle continue to blind us to the true cost of war? Centuries have passed since men in armour clashed on muddy fields beneath banners of kings, yet their echoes still reach us. The myths of chivalry, bravery, and noble sacrifice have survived far longer than the men who lived and died beneath them. In our stories, the medieval knight still rides forth, shining and pure, fighting for justice and love. In our minds, he has become timeless, reborn again and again in every soldier who steps onto a modern battlefield. Hollywood has carried the torch of those ancient myths, turning history into spectacle. The camera's lens polishes the rust of old wars until it gleams with romance. In movies and television, battlefields are stages for courage, not despair. Soldiers fall heroically, not in terror. Blades flash, armor gleams, and every death feels meaningful. Yet in doing so, something vital is lost. The suffocating fear, the screams, the confusion. We do not see the trembling hands or the hollow eyes of those who lived through it. We see only beauty in the struggle, order in the chaos, glory in the death. The same illusion lives on in video games and novels, where the medieval warrior's story has found new form. Players don the armor, wield the sword, and march into worlds where death is temporary and honor is rewarded. The battlefield becomes a playground, an escape rather than a trauma. The digital knight feels no pain, bears no scars, and never wakes in the night haunted by the faces of the fallen. Through this lens, war becomes simple again, a contest of skill, not a descent into suffering. The human cost is erased with the press of a button. This romanticization is not harmless. It shapes how we think, how we remember, how we justify. When we imagine war through the eyes of a hero, we forget that most who fought were never heroes at all. They were frightened men struggling to survive another day. The stories we tell, even now, still echo the same distortions born in medieval courts and monasteries. We still crave the illusion that violence can be noble, that bloodshed can have beauty. Modern soldiers, too, inherit the shadow of these myths. They are often spoken of as warriors, defenders of freedom, heirs to the valor of knights. Yet behind the uniform lies the same human heart, vulnerable, afraid, yearning to return home. Many who fight today find themselves caught between two worlds, the glorified image of the soldier that society adores, and the grim truth of what they experience. When they come back, scarred and changed, they face the same silence medieval warriors once did. The world loves the idea of courage but rarely understands its cost. The irony is that the same culture that celebrates the knight's honor often turns away from the aftermath of battle. We are drawn to the spectacle of war but not its consequences. Films end before the nightmares begin. Games reward victory, but never portray the hollow emptiness that follows it. Our fascination with medieval warfare, its armor, its discipline, its pageantry, feeds our collective denial. It allows us to imagine that war is something controlled, something righteous, something clean. Yet the truth remains unchanged. Whether fought with swords or with machines, every war leaves the same scars on bodies, on minds, on nations. The myths we inherited from the Middle Ages are comforting because they make sense of senselessness. But they also blind us, repeating the same mistake that poets and priests once made, mistaking suffering for glory. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of medieval warfare, that centuries later, we are still telling ourselves the same story. A story that makes war seem eternal, honorable, and almost beautiful. But beneath the armor of that illusion lies the same old truth. War, no matter the age, is never noble. It is only human, and that, in the end, is what makes it so tragically familiar. And from that realization comes the question the modern world must still face. If the stories we tell shape the wars we fight, what happens when we finally stop telling them? What can the brutality of medieval warfare teach us about the cost of modern war? How can understanding the past change the way we view our current conflicts? The medieval battlefield may seem distant now, its mud long dried, its swords rusted, but the lessons it left behind remain painfully relevant. Beneath the armor and the banners, war has always been the same. A collision of fear, pride, and power that leaves humanity scarred in ways that weapons alone cannot measure. The world has changed, but the human heart has not. One of the clearest lessons lies in how easily societies can glorify destruction. In the Middle Ages, kings and lords cloaked war in righteousness. Battles were framed as divine duty or national pride. The suffering of peasants, the starvation, the burning of fields, all were justified in the name of order, of faith, of destiny. Yet the result was always the same: death on a massive scale and generations left to rebuild what ambition had undone. Today, our reasons for war sound different, but the logic is hauntingly familiar. We still speak of liberation, of justice, of necessary violence. We still find ways to make war seem inevitable. But if medieval history teaches anything, it is that every necessary war leaves consequences far beyond the battlefield consequences that last long after the soldiers have gone home. Another lesson lies in the treatment of those who fight. In the medieval world, warriors were tools of their rulers valuable in life, disposable in death. The wounded were left to rot, the survivors forgotten. The physical and psychological scars they carried went largely unseen, their pain dismissed as weakness. And while modern armies offer medicine, therapy, and medals, the echoes of that neglect remain. Many veterans today still return home to silence and misunderstanding. The armor may have changed, but the isolation is the same. History also warns of how war consumes the societies that create it. The feudal system, built on the promise of protection through strength, eventually collapsed under its own weight. Endless campaigns drained treasuries, destroyed crops, and weakened kingdoms. Power fed on fear until there was nothing left to sustain it. Modern nations, too, risk the same fate, when conflict becomes a habit rather than a necessity, when the machinery of war grows so vast that peace begins to feel unnatural. But the most profound lesson of medieval warfare is not just about politics or power, it is about perspective. The chroniclers of that era often failed to see the full human cost of their wars. They wrote of victories and heroes, of sieges and kings, but rarely of the broken men who dug graves or the mothers who never saw their sons again. It is a silence that modern history still struggles to fill. Every time we tell the story of war without the story of its victims, we repeat that same omission. To truly learn from the past, we must remember what those chroniclers forgot, that every war, no matter how justified, reduces humanity before it redeems it. The soldiers who fought in the medieval age remind us that courage does not erase suffering, and that survival is not the same as victory. They fought, believing their deaths would give meaning to their lives. Many discovered too late that meaning was something the living must create, not the dead. Modern warfare, armed with machines and guided by technology, can sometimes make killing feel distant, even abstract. But the faces of medieval soldiers, those nameless men who looked into their enemies' eyes before striking, remind us that war has always been personal. Each wound, each loss, each act of violence carries weight. The lesson they left is not that war should never be fought, but that it should never be forgotten. In their pain, we see our reflection. Their struggles speak across centuries, urging us to recognize the fragile thread that binds all human conflict, that every battle, no matter the age, begins with belief and ends with loss. To remember that truth is to resist the cycle that history so often repeats. And as we look back across time through the haze of myth and memory, the warriors of the medieval age still whisper their warning. Learn from us, or become us. Because war may evolve, but its cost never changes. And until we learn to honor that cost, not just in words but in wisdom, the lessons of the past will remain written in blood. What if the greatest weapon in a medieval battle wasn't the sword but the mind? How did leaders use fear and terror to break their enemies before they even lifted a sword? In the brutal theatre of medieval warfare, victory often belonged to the army that mastered fear, both its creation and its control. Commanders understood that the human mind could be bent, shaken, and shattered long before the body was ever touched by steel. The battlefield was as much a psychological contest as it was a physical one, and the manipulation of terror became an art form subtle, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. The first blow of war was often struck in silence, days before the actual clash. Scouts would spread rumors, carefully planted whispers of an enemy's impossible numbers or supernatural strength. Tales of merciless knights, of armies that burned everything in their path, were enough to make even seasoned soldiers waver. Fear grew like a shadow, unseen but suffocating. By the time the opposing forces met, one side was already half defeated, its courage eaten away by imagination. When battle finally came, the spectacle itself was designed to terrify. Armies painted their shields and banners with symbols of death skulls, serpents, demons intended not for decoration but for domination. Warriors wore animal pelts, antlers, and blackened armor to appear larger, more monstrous than human. The Vikings, for instance, used their very image as a weapon. The sight of their dragon-proud ships cresting the waves struck dread long before the first raid began. Mongol horsemen, too, used illusion with terrifying precision, sending decoys and fires across the horizon to convince enemies they were surrounded. The sounds of war were just as powerful. War cries, drumming, and the blast of horns turned the battlefield into a living nightmare. The chaos of noise overwhelmed the senses, leaving soldiers disoriented before the fight had even begun. Some armies would charge while screaming in unison, a wall of sound that broke the enemy's nerve before contact. Others maintained eerie silence, advancing without a word, letting their quiet purpose speak louder than any roar. Both methods worked, because fear thrives in uncertainty. Then there were the deliberate acts of horror, crafted to send messages that words never could. Heads impaled on spikes at city gates, corpses displayed on walls, villages raised as warnings. These were not random cruelties but calculated tools of psychological warfare. The intention was clear: resistance meant annihilation. The Mongols perfected this practice, leaving only a handful alive after massacres to spread tales of their savagery. Each story became an army of its own, marching ahead of them, softening the next enemy long before the first arrow was loosed. Even the manipulation of hope became a weapon. False retreats, a favourite tactic of nomadic and steppe warriors, played on the instinct to pursue. Feigned weakness lured enemies into traps. Their confidence turned against them. Once surrounded, realization came too late, and panic rippled through their ranks like wildfire. The same emotion that drove men to bravery could, when twisted, drive them to ruin. Leaders understood the delicate balance of fear within their own armies too. A frightened soldier could be dangerous, but a terrified one was useless. To prevent collapse, commanders used ritual, unity, and faith to bind their men. Some armies marched behind relics and crosses, believing divine power shielded them. Others relied on chants or oaths to drown out doubt. The goal was not to erase fear, but to channel it, to transform it from paralysis into aggression. Fear, when contained, became fuel. When uncontained, it consumed everything. Psychological warfare also extended beyond the battlefield. Diplomacy, espionage, and propaganda were early tools of manipulation. Letters threatening total destruction, forged messages sowing distrust among allies, and public executions of traitors all served the same purpose: to break resolve before swords were drawn. A single rumour could win what 1,000 men might lose. What made these tactics so effective was their simplicity. Human fear has not changed across centuries. It feeds on the same elements: uncertainty, pain, isolation, and loss of control. Medieval generals knew this instinctively, even without the science to explain it. They did not need to understand the mind to master it. They only needed to exploit it. In many cases, the greatest victories were those where steel never met flesh. Entire cities surrendered at the sight of a marching army, convinced resistance was futile. The power of fear saved lives on one side and ended them on the other. It was, in its own terrible way, the most efficient weapon ever forged. But fear cuts both ways. The same terror that weakened the enemy also haunted those who wielded it. Soldiers who used cruelty as a tool often found themselves changed by it, their humanity stripped away piece by piece. The commanders who unleashed horror learned that once fear is freed, it cannot always be controlled. And so, the true genius of psychological warfare was not only in spreading fear, but in surviving it. The next test for any army and any man was not whether they could inspire terror, but whether they could withstand it. Because on the medieval battlefield, victory belonged not just to the strong, but to the ones who could keep their minds intact when the world around them was falling apart. In battle, could the smallest flicker of fear lead to total collapse? How did commanders keep their warriors from breaking? And what happened when they failed? In the medieval world, armies were not machines of iron and order. They were fragile, breathing organisms held together by willpower and belief. Strength lay not only in numbers or steel, but in the invisible thread of morale that bound men to their cause. The moment that thread snapped, even the mightiest host could dissolve into chaos. Commanders knew this better than anyone. Their greatest challenge was not defeating the enemy, but keeping their own soldiers from crumbling under the weight of terror, hunger, and despair. Before the clash of armies, leaders worked tirelessly to prepare the hearts of their men. Charismatic kings and generals understood that victory began with conviction. They spoke to their soldiers not as rulers, but as brothers in arms. A well-timed speech could transform trembling men into instruments of courage. It reminded them of home, of God, of glory, or sometimes simply of survival. The words didn't need to be true, they only needed to be believed. A single commander's presence could hold an entire army together. Richard the Lionheart was said to ride through his ranks before battle, his golden armour glinting like sunlight, a vision meant to assure his men that destiny was on their side. Joan of Arc carried the banner of faith, her voice breaking through the fear of thousands, turning panic into prayer. These leaders were not merely strategists, they were masters of emotion, wielding hope and fear like twin blades. But when words failed, fear itself became a tool of control. Medieval discipline was brutal and uncompromising. Desertion, cowardice, or even hesitation could mean public execution. Commanders knew that for men to face death, they had to fear their leaders more than the enemy. It was a grim calculation, but one that often worked. In the heat of battle, the terror of punishment kept ranks from breaking when instinct urged them to flee. Still, morale was fragile, easily lifted, easily shattered. A sudden change in weather, a rumor of betrayal, or the sight of a commander falling could unravel an army in moments. History is filled with battles lost not through strength of arms, but through collapse of spirit. At the Battle of Hastings, when William the Conqueror was rumoured dead, his troops wavered and nearly fled. Only when he lifted his helmet to show his face did the tide of panic turn. In that instant, morale was restored not by strategy, but by sight, by presence, by faith renewed. Hunger and exhaustion were constant enemies of the medieval soldier's will. Campaigns dragged on for months, sometimes years. Food spoiled, rain soaked everything, and disease crept through camps like an unseen predator. The starving fought with less heart, the sick fought with less strength. Commanders who could feed and shelter their men were more likely to keep them loyal. Those who could not often found their armies evaporating into the night. Faith was another pillar of morale. In an age where religion shaped every thought, soldiers believed that divine favour determined victory. Priests walked among the ranks before battle, blessing weapons, hearing confessions, and promising eternal reward for the fallen. To die in battle was to die with purpose if one truly believed. That faith dulled fear, replacing it with fatalism. Yet when defeat came, that same faith turned to despair, convincing men they had been abandoned by heaven itself. Music, banners, and ritual also played their part. The flutter of familiar colours above the chaos of combat reminded soldiers that they were not alone. The rhythmic beat of drums or horns gave order to fear, anchoring minds in the noise. These simple symbols could turn panic into unity, their repetition soothing the instinct to flee. Medieval commanders knew that an army's morale was a delicate flame. Feed it too little, and it died. Feed it too much, and it burned out of control. But when morale broke, it was like glass shattering. A retreat could become a rout in seconds. Soldiers who moments earlier had fought shoulder to shoulder turned into a stampede of terrified men. The chain of command collapsed, and the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Those left behind often didn't die from the enemy's sword, but from the trampling of their own comrades. The medieval commander's greatest weapon was not the sword, but the mind of his army, the shared illusion of control. To lead was to understand how to manage the invisible tides of emotion. Fear, pride, faith, desperation. When harnessed, they forged victory. When neglected, they destroyed it. Because in the end, war was never just about tactics or numbers. It was about belief, the fragile kind that could lift men into legends or drown them in despair. And for those who fought, it was belief alone that kept them standing long after their strength was gone. Yet morale could only hold for so long before the world around it broke down. The next battle for survival came not from within the mind, but from the elements themselves, from hunger, disease, and the merciless demands of war's logistics. How could an army of thousands march across hostile land, facing not only the enemy, but also the crushing weight of hunger, disease, and exhaustion? What really determined whether an army would survive long enough to reach the battlefield? For all the grandeur and chaos of medieval battles, most of war's suffering happened long before the first sword was drawn. Victory often depended less on strategy and courage than on the quiet, relentless struggle of survival between destinations. The march, the endless road of mud, wind, and weariness, was where armies were truly tested. The soldier's greatest enemy was not always another man, but the world itself. Medieval armies were vast and unwieldy. Tens of thousands of men, horses, carts, and supplies moved slowly across the countryside, leaving the land behind them stripped bare. Feeding such an army was a logistical nightmare. Each man needed roughly 2 pounds of food a day, each horse 10 times that in fodder. Armies devoured everything in their path, grain, livestock, and even the bark of trees when supplies ran dry. Foraging parties spread out ahead, searching for food, often clashing with peasants or enemy scouts. Starvation was not an exception. It was a companion. Water, too, became a weapon of chance. Rivers offered relief but carried disease. Stagnant pools brought sickness faster than thirst. Soldiers drank whatever they could find: muddy puddles, swamp water, anything wet enough to fill a cup. Dysentery, fever, and infection tore through camps, killing more men than enemy blades ever could. Medieval warfare was not only fought by warriors, but by the unseen armies of pestilence that marched alongside them. The burden of movement itself was punishing. Armour chafed against skin, weapons grew heavier with every mile, and boots rotted in the constant damp. The wounded and sick were dragged behind on wagons, slowing the pace, sometimes abandoned when the road grew too difficult. The march was an act of endurance, a test of patience and pain. Many fell by the wayside, not in battle, but in silence. Commanders who failed to manage these challenges doomed their armies before they ever reached their enemies. Entire campaigns collapsed under the weight of poor planning. The Crusades, for instance, were as much battles against distance and climate as against foes. Desert heat burned through supplies in days, and cold nights froze the unprepared. Thousands perished from exhaustion long before setting eyes on the enemy. Logistics, more than courage, decided the fate of kingdoms. Communication was another invisible battlefield. Orders had to travel by word of mouth or parchment carried by riders who could be delayed, lost, or killed. Armies stretched across miles, and a single missed message could turn order into chaos. An advance made too soon, or a retreat made too late, often cost entire divisions. Many medieval defeats were born not from weakness of arms, but from the slow death of coordination. Then there were the beasts of burden, the lifeblood of any campaign. Horses and oxen hauled the food, siege engines, and tents. Their survival was as vital as that of any knight. Yet they too suffered from hunger and disease. When they collapsed, carts were abandoned, supplies lost. An army without its beasts was an army doomed to starve. Even rest offered no mercy. At night, soldiers slept in makeshift camps, exposed to rain and cold. Fires were scarce, too visible to enemies. Blankets were rare, roofs non-existent. Insects, rats, and filth filled every corner of the camp. The smell was unbearable. Yet amid the squalor, men sang, prayed, and dreamed of home, clinging to fragments of hope to survive one more day. The logistics of medieval warfare were a delicate balance between control and chaos. Armies that managed to reach the battlefield intact had already won their first victory, not over another force, but over hunger, exhaustion, and despair. For those who failed, the road itself became their graveyard. And as if these struggles were not enough, another enemy always waited, one silent, immense, and merciless. The land itself. Terrain, weather, and the sheer unpredictability of nature could turn the strongest army into dust, proving that in medieval warfare, even the earth had a will of its own. What if the true strength of medieval armies wasn't only in their swords, but in the untold stories of the women who stood by them? How did women shape the course of battles, even when history forgot them? The chronicles of medieval war are filled with the names of kings, knights, and conquerors. Yet, behind every march, every siege, and every so-called victory, there were women whose hands, hearts, and courage made survival possible. Their stories were often written in silence, in letters, in whispers, in the quiet acts that held armies together. For while men fought with blades, women fought with endurance, cunning, and resolve. Most women in wartime were not soldiers, but that did not mean they were distant from battle. When their husbands, fathers, and sons went to war, women became the anchors of entire communities. They managed estates, oversaw harvests, and negotiated with local lords to protect their families. Their labour kept the armies fed and the kingdoms functioning. Without them, the war machine would have collapsed under its own weight. But not all women remained behind the walls. When war came to their doorsteps, they fought. During sieges, noble women often took command of castle defences. One such figure was Nicolas de la Haye, who in the early 13th century defended Lincoln Castle against repeated attacks. She commanded men, organised supplies, and refused surrender even when outnumbered. Her courage saved the stronghold and altered the course of English politics. Women like her were rare in the records, but not in reality. Across Europe, when cities were besieged, women joined the fight alongside men. They carried water to douse fires, hurled stones from ramparts, and tended to the wounded while arrows rained from above. Some disguised themselves as men, taking up arms in the field. The reasons were as varied as the women themselves: honor, necessity, vengeance, or the sheer will to survive. In the chaos of war, identity blurred. What mattered was not who you were, but whether you could fight. Beyond the battlefield, women served in roles just as vital. They followed armies as camp followers, cooks, healers, and caretakers of the wounded. They washed clothes, mended armor, and nursed soldiers dying of infection or despair. Life in these camps was harsh, often dangerous, but without their presence, armies could not move. Some were wives following their husbands. Others were widows or outcasts who found in the army their only means of survival. They endured the same hunger, cold, and disease as the men, and yet history rarely spoke their names. There were also women who fought with words and wits rather than weapons. Queens and noblewomen negotiated truces, gathered intelligence, and acted as spies. Messages hidden in embroidery, coded letters carried beneath garments. These were the quiet tools of warfare. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, was as formidable in diplomacy as any general in battle. Her political maneuvering helped shape the fate of two kingdoms, proving that power did not always require armor. Religion, too, provided women a form of battlefield. Nuns and lay sisters tended to the wounded in monasteries turned hospitals. They prayed over soldiers, cleaned wounds, and buried the dead. Some believed they were serving God. Others simply sought to ease the suffering left in war's wake. Their compassion became a silent resistance to the cruelty surrounding them. Even among the lower classes, women's resilience became a form of defiance. They scavenged what armies left behind, rebuilt villages after raids, and cared for orphans and the elderly when no one else remained. They were the invisible bridge between destruction and recovery, the reason civilization continued at all. Yet, despite their contributions, history often reduced them to footnotes. Chroniclers, almost always men, focused on the spectacle of combat, not the quiet heroism that sustained it. Women who fought were often erased, their deeds attributed to others or dismissed as legend. Those who led were called exceptional, as if courage itself was unnatural in a woman's heart. But courage knows no gender. The women of the medieval world proved this time and again, not through fantasy or myth, but through endurance. They were the ones who held the line when others fell, who turned despair into determination. Some wielded swords, others wielded strength of will. All of them fought in one way or another, and when the battles ended, they remained to rebuild what was broken, to mourn what was lost, and to raise the next generation beneath the shadow of wars they did not start. Yet, in those generations were children who would grow up not knowing peace. Some victims of war, others unwilling participants in it. Their stories, too, have been forgotten. But just as women fought in the margins of history, so too did the children who lived through the wars of men. How did children become soldiers, spies, and prisoners of war in a time when innocence was supposed to be their greatest shield? How did warfare steal their futures? In the medieval world, war did not discriminate. When armies marched, they devoured everything in their pathfields, homes, families, and the fragile boundary between childhood and survival. Children, too young to understand the reasons for war but old enough to feel its consequences, found themselves drawn into its shadow. Some became victims, some became tools, and others, in their small and tragic way, became participants. For many boys, the path to war began early. Sons of nobles were sent to castles at just 7 or 8 years old to serve as pages. What began as training in etiquette and duty was, in truth, an education in obedience and violence. They cleaned weapons, tended to knights, and learned to ride and fight. By 14, a boy might become a squire, his innocence traded for armor polishing and battlefield errands. He watched his masters kill and die, fetching new swords, dressing wounds, holding the reins of terrified horses. And one day, often sooner than expected, he would be handed a blade and told to fight. For children born to peasants, there was no training, only exposure. War came to them uninvited. Armies passing through villages seized food, burned crops, and conscripted the strong. Young boys were used as messengers or guides, their small size allowing them to slip through enemy lines. Some carried secret letters tucked in their clothes, their lives hanging on their ability to keep silent under threat. Others joined the ranks as archers, valued for their agility and lightness of frame. The English longbowmen, for instance, often began their deadly craft as children, their bodies shaped sometimes permanently by years of drawing powerful bows before their bones were fully grown. But for every child who served, many more suffered. The siege was perhaps the cruelest teacher. Within city walls, children starved beside their mothers, watching as food supplies dwindled and hope disappeared. When defenders fell, the victors rarely spared the young. Some were taken as slaves, others as hostages, a form of living ransom. Noble children were especially valuable, bartered like treasures to secure treaties or ensure obedience. Their lives became currency in the endless trade of power. For those captured or orphaned, the trauma did not end with the battle. Children raised in the aftermath of war often grew up in the service of their conquerors, stripped of name and heritage. Some were forced into labor, others were molded into soldiers for the very lords who had destroyed their families. The concept of childhood as we know it, a time of innocence and protection, barely existed. To survive was to adapt, to learn fear as a language. Even the stories that reached future generations carried echoes of that loss. The so-called Children's Crusade of the early 13th century remains one of the most haunting examples. Thousands of young boys and girls, inspired by faith and manipulated by adults, set out to reclaim the Holy Land. Few ever returned. Many died from hunger or exposure, others were sold into slavery. Whether myth or truth, the tale revealed a devastating reality. Even the youngest could be consumed by the machinery of war. Behind the romantic image of knights and kings stood countless unseen children, those who tended fires in military camps, who buried the dead, who grew up too fast because the world gave them no choice. For them, war was not a story of valor but of survival. Their laughter faded into the drumbeat of marching feet, their futures reshaped by forces they could not name. In every burned village and ruined castle, the silence of children lingered, a reminder that the cost of war was never paid only by the strong. The echoes of their lost innocence haunted the generations that followed, shaping the very soul of medieval life. And beyond the lives of women and children, that shadow stretched further still to entire towns and villages left scarred by conflict, where the war did not end with the fighting, but lived on in the ruins of everyday existence. What happened when war came knocking at the door of an innocent village? How did civilians become unwilling pawns in the cruel game of medieval warfare? In the medieval world, the battlefield did not end where the armies withdrew. For those who did not fight, the farmers, the merchants, the mothers and children, war came, not as a clash of honor, but as a tide of destruction that swept away everything familiar. Towns and villages were not spectators to history, they were its casualties. Every campaign left behind a trail of smoke and silence, and every victory was written in the ashes of homes. When armies marched, they did not bring their own food. They took it. Soldiers seized crops, slaughtered livestock, and emptied granaries, leaving famine in their wake. For peasants, the sound of distant horns or the sight of dust rising on the horizon meant terror. It meant the end of another harvest, the loss of another season's labor. Entire families fled into forests, carrying only what they could hold. Those who stayed risked everything, hoping that surrender might spare their lives. It rarely did. Pillaging was not an accident of war, it was its economy. Soldiers were often paid through plunder, looting villages and towns for whatever wealth they could find. Gold, grain, cloth, even people, nothing was off limits. Women were taken, homes were burned, and churches, once considered sanctuaries, became tombs. The line between conqueror and criminal vanished. Survival made beasts of men. When the fighting ended, there were no victors, only ruins. Sieges were the worst of all. A besieged town became a world unto itself, a place where hunger and fear reigned supreme. As supplies dwindled, bread turned to dust and water to filth. Families ate rats, dogs, and, in the darkest hours, worse. Disease followed quickly, carried by the dead who could no longer be buried. Those inside prayed for deliverance, even as they heard the enemy's engines pounding against their walls. For the defenders, surrender often promised slaughter. For the attackers, starvation was a weapon more reliable than the sword. When the gates finally fell, vengeance came swiftly. Civilians, old, young, innocent, were caught in the storm. Beyond the walls, life was no kinder. Villages near battlefields became resource wells for both sides. Men were conscripted to dig trenches, haul stones, or carry supplies. Women were forced to cook and clean for soldiers. Children fetched water or gathered firewood, their small hands trembling under watchful eyes. The people who once tilled the soil to feed their families now toiled under the shadow of death, to feed armies that saw them as nothing more than tools. Even those who escaped the immediate violence faced long years of despair. Fields burned in the fighting could take generations to recover. The loss of livestock meant famine, and famine meant death. Roads filled with refugees starving, barefoot, carrying memories heavier than their few belongings. They moved from one shattered village to another, searching for safety that did not exist. And yet, despite the horror, life went on. After each war, the survivors began again, rebuilding from rubble with bare hands and quiet determination. The human instinct to endure was stronger than the fires of war. Some rebuilt their homes on scorched land. Others returned to rebuild their churches first, as if to remind the heavens that faith still lingered among the ruins. The resilience of these people, ordinary, forgotten, was the hidden foundation upon which kingdoms rebuilt themselves. Still, the psychological toll remained. Children who had watched their parents die grew into adults who mistrusted peace. Villagers who had seen knights burn their homes learned that protection came with a price. Even in times of supposed stability, the memory of war hung like a scent in the air, a reminder that safety was temporary, fragile, and always conditional. The medieval world's beauty, the castles, cathedrals, and cities that still stand today, was built on land soaked in the suffering of those who never carried a sword. For every knight celebrated in song, there were 1,000 nameless civilians whose stories vanished with the smoke of their burning homes. They were the true witnesses of war, the silent majority who paid for the ambitions of kings. Their pain shaped the very fabric of medieval society, a fabric woven from endurance, loss, and the quiet heroism of survival. And above this landscape of devastation stood one institution that claimed to speak for mercy, yet often blessed the violence: the Church. Its voice echoed over every battlefield, declaring what was just, what was holy, and what could be forgiven in the name of God. In the heart of medieval Europe, a time when belief in the divine shaped every aspect of life, war was not simply a matter of territory or power. It was often framed as a holy endeavour, a sacred duty carried out in the name of God. The Church, a towering institution of immense influence, held the power to transform the chaos of battle into a divine mission. But how did it convince men, noble knights, peasants and soldiers alike, that they were shedding blood not for glory or gain, but for God's will? The concept of the just war was central to the medieval Church's role in warfare. According to this doctrine, certain wars could be justified if they were fought for the defense of Christianity, or to punish those who threatened the Christian faith. The Church argued that war could be wholly sanctioned by God as long as it served a divine purpose. And it wasn't just a theological matter. Religious leaders, including the Pope, wielded this doctrine like a weapon of their own, using it to rally entire armies. Through fiery sermons and papal edicts, they painted wars as holy missions, claiming that soldiers would earn divine favour and salvation by participating. One of the most notorious examples of this manipulation of faith through war is the Crusades, a series of religious wars fought between the 11th and 13th centuries. The Crusades were launched by the Church under the banner of religious necessity. They aimed to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, but the Church didn't just promise spiritual rewards to those who fought. For many, the call to arms was wrapped in the promise of land, riches, and status. The very same men who took up their swords under the guise of religious fervour often had more earthly ambitions cloaked in the righteous veneer of a divine cause. Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095 exemplified this intertwining of faith and warfare. With fervour, he called upon knights, lords, and peasants alike to join the Crusades, offering the ultimate spiritual incentive: absolution from sins. God wills it, he proclaimed, invoking the will of God as both the reason for the war and the reward for the warrior. The promise was irresistible. In an age where the fear of damnation was a constant shadow, the notion of fighting for God's will was not just a noble pursuit, it was a ticket to eternal salvation. But how could religious leaders maintain such control over the masses? How could they convince individuals that taking part in slaughter was, in fact, a righteous act? It came down to the careful shaping of perception. The Church had long been a master of symbolism, turning the brutal, bloody nature of warfare into something pure. Crosses were emblazoned on the shields of knights, while the clergy invoked the image of martyrdom, encouraging soldiers to see their sacrifices as divine acts. In a time when life was often short and fraught with suffering, the promise of spiritual redemption for fighting in God's name was more than a comforting thought. It was a powerful motivator. At the same time, the church's influence was not confined to the pulpit. Kings and nobles, too, recognized the value of religious sanction in warfare. Rulers used the church to legitimize their military campaigns, framing their conquests as righteous causes ordained by God. A king's right to wage war was often justified by the church's endorsement, with religious leaders ensuring that soldiers believed they were participating in a sacred mission rather than a power struggle. Yet, despite this religious facade, the motivations for war were rarely as pure as they appeared. While the promise of divine favor was a compelling incentive, the reality of medieval warfare was more pragmatic. The Crusades, for instance, weren't just about reclaiming Jerusalem, they were about control of trade routes, wealth, and power. The lines between piety and politics often blurred. For the knights and soldiers who fought in these holy wars, the idea of God's will was a convenient justification, masking the more personal desires for land and glory. As the medieval world descended deeper into religious conflict, the lines between divine mission and earthly ambition grew increasingly difficult to discern. What began as a divine calling often ended as a brutal struggle for power. Soldiers found themselves drawn into a never-ending cycle of war, convinced they were serving God, yet ever more entangled in the political machinations of kings, bishops, and the church itself. The question lingered: were these wars truly holy, or were they simply another tool of power, wielded by those who understood how to manipulate faith for their own ends? The role of the church in medieval warfare, with its combination of spiritual promises and political power, created a delicate balance between belief and manipulation. As we turn our attention to the practical and political motives behind these wars, we'll explore how rulers and kings used the church to not only justify their conquests, but to manipulate the very hearts and minds of their people. In the medieval world, the line between the sacred and the secular was often more like a blurry smudge than a distinct divide. Kings and lords, though driven by ambitions of power and conquest, frequently found themselves in a delicate dance with the church, whose divine authority could bless or curse their military pursuits. What if the religious wars of this era weren't entirely about faith at all, but instead about control, politics, and the consolidation of power? The role of religion in medieval warfare wasn't just a matter of piety, it was a carefully crafted tool for manipulation. Medieval rulers were acutely aware of the church's influence over the masses. It wasn't merely the Pope who wielded spiritual power. Local bishops, abbots, and priests shaped the daily lives of the people. Their sermons and teachings were often intertwined with the actions of the state. For kings, aligning themselves with the church wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a pragmatic strategy. To wage war under the banner of God's will gave their campaigns a moral legitimacy that was hard to contest. Who could argue against a war deemed holy, especially when the church itself lent its approval? The relationship between monarchy and the church was often symbiotic, but it wasn't always peaceful. Kings and emperors sometimes struggled for supremacy over the ecclesiastical hierarchy, yet in many cases, they learned to manipulate this relationship for political gain. One of the clearest examples of this manipulation can be found in the reign of King Henry II of England. In the late 12th century, Henry sought to consolidate his power over the English church, using his influence to ensure that clergy were loyal to the crown rather than the Pope. This political manoeuvring ultimately led to the infamous murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose loyalty to the Pope put him at odds with Henry's ambitions. In the end, Becket's death didn't just serve as a tragic moment in history, it was a stark reminder of how religion and politics were often indistinguishable. Another example can be seen in the use of excommunication. The threat of excommunication, or the promise of absolution, was a powerful tool that could shape the actions of kings and warriors alike. Excommunication meant not just a spiritual sentence but a very real political one. A king who had been excommunicated could see his kingdom falter, as his subjects might no longer recognize his authority or loyalty to God. On the flip side, kings who aligned themselves with the church could use the promise of absolution or divine favor to rally support for their wars, persuading people that to fight in the name of God was not just a religious duty but a civic one as well. The warrior class itself wasn't immune to this manipulation. Feudal lords, who ruled over vast tracts of land and depended on the loyalty of their knights, often found it useful to intertwine the concept of religious duty with the obligations of feudal loyalty. A knight's oath to his lord was frequently reinforced by the Church's teachings, making the relationship between the two unbreakable in the eyes of the faithful. When the king declared war, the Church reinforced the message, framing the conflict as a righteous mission. A knight, after all, was not just a soldier, he was a man of faith. And in a world where religious devotion was inseparable from daily life, these warriors were persuaded to fight not just for their lord, but for the very will of God. The Church also played a key role in maintaining feudal control. Its vast wealth and landholdings gave it immense power, and the clergy often found themselves deeply enmeshed in the feudal system. Many knights and lords owed their allegiance as much to the Church as they did to their earthly rulers. The Church ensured that the system of loyalty and servitude remained in place, perpetuating the cycle of power that kept both the clergy and the feudal lords in positions of control. The promise of eternal salvation was often enough to keep the warrior class loyal to their superiors, even as the lines between the spiritual and the secular began to fade. In essence, the medieval Church was not just a moral authority, it was a political force. The intertwining of religion and warfare served not only to inspire knights and peasants to fight, but also to consolidate the power of kings and nobles. The moral justification for war, framed as divine will, often concealed the more human ambitions of rulers who sought to expand their territories, strengthen their thrones, and manipulate their subjects. As the medieval era unfolded, it became increasingly clear that religion was just as much a tool of control as it was a guide for the soul. As we turn our attention to the legacy of these wars, we will begin to see how this delicate relationship between the Church, politics, and warfare left a profound mark on Europe. These conflicts not only shaped the course of history, but also set the stage for centuries of religious and political struggle, the effects of which are still felt today. What if the nations we know today weren't built solely by treaties or diplomacy, but by the bloodshed of medieval warfare? It is a striking thought, yet the rise of modern Europe was deeply shaped by the conflicts of the Middle Ages. The constant state of warfare between kingdoms, empires, and feudal lords created an ever-evolving landscape of power, where borders were not drawn in peace but on the battleground. These centuries of conflict did more than just shift territories. They forged the very foundations of the nation-states that would later define the political landscape of Europe, and indeed, the entire world. Medieval warfare, especially the prolonged conflicts such as the 100 Years' War, played a pivotal role in the creation of the nation-state concept. The 100 Years' War, which raged from 1337 to 1453, wasn't merely a contest between England and France over land. It was a battle for identity, a fight that transformed the very notion of sovereignty. In the early Middle Ages, the idea of a nation, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. Kingdoms were often fragmented, with loyalty lying more with local lords than with a distant monarch. But by the end of the 100 Years' War, the concepts of centralized power and national identity had begun to take shape. For the French, the long struggle against the English invaders helped to solidify the sense of a unified French nation. Figures like Joan of Arc, who symbolized the spirit of national resistance, became more than mere military leaders. They became symbols of a collective identity. As the war drew to a close, France emerged not just victorious, but with a renewed sense of its own sovereignty. The struggle against England had welded together disparate regions into a single entity, strengthening royal authority and laying the groundwork for a unified nation-state. On the English side, the war had a different effect. While the English kings lost much of their territorial claims in France, the war also spurred internal changes. It fostered a growing sense of national identity among the English, as the conflict united them under the banner of a common cause. The war also had significant political consequences, including the weakening of feudal power and the rise of a more centralized monarchy. The English monarchy, which had been relatively weak compared to its continental counterparts, found new ways to exercise control over its nobles and assert royal authority. In this way, the bloodshed of the 100 Years' War directly contributed to the evolution of modern British power. Beyond the 100 Years' War, warfare in the Middle Ages continued to shape the borders and identities of emerging European nations. The wars that followed, such as the Italian wars in the 15th and 16th centuries, further solidified the centralization of power and the formation of nation-states. Italy, once a patchwork of city-states and territories, saw its political landscape redrawn as powerful kingdoms and foreign empires vied for control. Through a series of wars and alliances, Italy was eventually unified in the 19th century. Yet the roots of that unification were sown centuries earlier, in the bloody battles fought between rival factions. The concept of sovereignty itself was shaped by the constant state of conflict. Kings and lords, once beholden to a decentralized feudal system, began to consolidate power in ways that would lead to the rise of the modern nation-state. The need for centralized control became clear in the face of ongoing warfare. Monarchs who could effectively command armies, control resources, and maintain order within their borders were able to ensure their survival in an age when territorial conflict was relentless. The nature of medieval warfare, with its reliance on knights, castles, and fortified cities, also led to the development of more sophisticated military technologies and strategies, all of which were designed to maintain control over ever-expanding territories. Throughout the Middle Ages, alliances were forged and broken, often as a result of warfare. The marriage of political power with military strategy became a hallmark of the period, and it was through war that these alliances were tested and solidified. The relationship between military conquest and political unity was undeniable. Each battle fought not only determined the fates of kingdoms, but also shaped the political landscape for generations to come. As monarchs secured their dominance on the battlefield, they also laid the groundwork for the political institutions and systems of governance that would eventually characterize modern nation-states. The constant state of war during the Middle Ages ensured that nothing remained static. The borders of kingdoms and empires shifted with each conflict, creating an environment where the rise and fall of powers was a continuous cycle. Yet, in the aftermath of these conflicts, a new political reality began to take shape. The incessant fighting, with its toll on both land and lives, birthed the concept of a sovereign, centralized nation-state, an idea that would dominate Europe for centuries to come. As the echoes of medieval warfare reverberate through the centuries, we begin to see how deeply these conflicts influenced not just Europe, but the wider world. In the next section, we will shift our focus beyond the borders of Europe, examining how the expansion of empires through war reshaped the global landscape, particularly in the era of colonization. What if the roots of colonialism were seeded not by exploration, but by the wars fought in the fields of Europe centuries before? How did medieval conflicts, which were once contained to the blood-soaked battlefields of France or England, ultimately reshape the entire globe? The answer lies in the very nature of warfare that defined the medieval era. A brutal, expansive force that didn't just settle territorial disputes within Europe, but sowed the seeds for the rise of global empires and the spread of European influence far beyond the continent. The same strategies, tactics, and concepts of warfare that dominated the battlefields of Europe would, over time, be carried across oceans, reshaping entire continents. In the wake of constant conflict, European powers began to expand their reach, first through military conquest and later through colonization. The Age of Exploration, which began in the late 15th century, was not merely an era of discovery, it was a direct outgrowth of the aggressive military campaigns and territorial ambitions of European nations. Spain, France, and England, each a kingdom born from centuries of warfare, would become the key players in this global expansion. The Crusades, which had seen European knights venture eastward in the name of religion, laid the groundwork for the idea of conquering distant lands in the name of faith, glory, and empire. The same religious fervour that drove knights to the Holy Land now propelled explorers and conquistadors across the seas, seeking new territories to claim, convert, and dominate. Take the example of Spain, whose rise as a global empire was deeply intertwined with the military culture of medieval warfare. The Spanish conquest of the Americas in the early 16th century was not just a search for gold or land, it was a continuation of the same drive for territorial dominance that had defined earlier European conflicts. Spanish conquistadors, like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, applied the same tactics they had honed in European battles to the Americas, using superior weaponry, military strategy, and alliances with local factions to overpower vast civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas. The violence of medieval European battles, the sieges, the cavalry charges, the brutal assaults, was now unleashed on an entirely new world, reshaping it in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades prior. Similarly, the French and English expanded their influence through war, not just in Europe but in the far corners of the globe. France's territorial ambitions in the Americas led to conflicts with Spain, England, and indigenous populations alike, all fought with the same kind of military strategies developed in medieval Europe. The English, with their naval prowess and mercenary armies, established colonies across the Americas, from Virginia to the Caribbean, creating a global empire built on the foundations of centuries of European conflict. The violence and conquest that began on European soil now played out in places like the Americas, Africa, and Asia, where European powers used warfare to carve out colonies and reshape the world. The same medieval concepts of feudal loyalty, territorial control, and martial prowess found new expressions in these global conquests. The spread of European culture, religion, and governance was often intertwined with the brutality of military occupation. Christianity, already tightly bound to the wars fought in Europe, became the justification for the colonization of indigenous lands, with missionaries and conquistadors alike seeking to impose not just a foreign rule, but a foreign way of life. This era of imperial expansion was deeply shaped by the military strategies and ideologies that had been refined in Europe's medieval conflicts. The use of gunpowder, the development of fortified positions, and the emphasis on cavalry and disciplined armies, all these medieval innovations found their way into the hands of European colonizers. What had been forged on the battlefields of France, Spain, and England was now applied to the conquest of vast, unfamiliar lands. Yet, the impact of this military-driven expansion was not limited to Europe. The spread of European imperialism fundamentally reshaped the cultures, economies, and societies of the regions that were colonized. From the Americas to Africa, indigenous populations were displaced, enslaved, or destroyed in the wake of European military conquest. The very notion of sovereignty that had taken root in medieval Europe was applied to new territories, where the borders and boundaries of newly formed empires were drawn not by diplomacy, but by the military prowess of European powers. In many ways, the global impact of medieval warfare was felt most acutely in the form of colonialism, which brought European values and governance to the furthest reaches of the world. The medieval obsession with territorial control, conquest, and military dominance was now being imposed on distant lands, where it collided with entirely different ways of life and systems of governance. The brutality of this expansion, rooted in centuries of warfare, was not just an extension of European ambition, it was the very mechanism that transformed the world into what we recognize today. As we move from examining the global impact of medieval warfare, we'll begin to explore how these legacies and war-related ideologies continue to influence the contemporary world. The political structures and power dynamics established during the age of empire building have left a lasting imprint on modern conflicts, showing just how far the shadows of medieval warfare stretch. How are today's wars still shaped by the battles fought in the Middle Ages? What lessons dark and forgotten do we still carry into modern conflict? The echoes of medieval warfare, though centuries removed, still reverberate in today's global conflicts. The strategies, tactics, and even the ideologies that fueled medieval battles have not only endured, but continue to shape the way wars are fought. From the siege warfare used in ancient castles to the religious justifications for modern-day violence, the medieval legacy runs deep in the psyche of today's military powers. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval warfare is the use of siege tactics. In the Middle Ages, castles were the epitome of defense, and armies often found themselves engaged in long, drawn-out sieges that could last for months or even years. The methods of laying siege to fortified positions such as tunneling, battering rams, and siege towers were refined through centuries of brutal conflict. Today, while technology has advanced in unimaginable ways, the core principles of siege warfare still influence modern military strategy. The idea of cutting off supplies, surrounding a stronghold, and waiting for the enemy to surrender or starve remains a relevant tactic in contemporary warfare, whether in urban warfare or in the form of economic sanctions aimed at starving a nation into submission. The principle may have evolved, but its roots are unmistakably medieval. Another medieval legacy that lingers in modern conflicts is the use of religious justification for war. The Crusades, with their fervent appeal to religious duty, set a precedent for linking divine will with the rationale for violent conflict. Today, conflicts in the Middle East, for example, are often framed in religious terms, with both sides invoking the will of God to legitimize their actions. While the motivations behind such wars are, of course, multifaceted political, economic, and territorial, The idea that war can be holy, righteous, or divinely ordained has deep medieval roots. In modern warfare, soldiers, insurgents, and leaders alike still draw upon the psychological and ideological power of religion to justify violence, much as they did during the Crusades and other medieval conflicts. Even the very notion of the warrior continues to be steeped in medieval archetypes. The knight in shining armour, the fearless leader charging into battle with honour and duty, is a figure that still resonates today. In modern armies, the idea of the warrior ethos persists, with soldiers trained to view themselves as part of a long line of warriors defending their nation, faith, or ideals. The imagery of medieval chivalry and knighthood, with its strict codes of conduct and loyalty to the crown or cause, continues to shape military culture. Modern soldiers, much like their medieval predecessors, are often expected to act with honour, courage, and self-sacrifice. The same sense of duty and loyalty that drove knights to take up arms in service of their kings still informs the motivations of soldiers fighting for their countries today. But it's not just in the tactics and strategies that medieval warfare endures. The emotional and psychological toll of war has also been carried forward through the centuries. The trauma of battle, the psychological scars left by prolonged conflict, are not unique to modern warfare. Medieval soldiers, after enduring long sieges or brutal battles, often returned home scarred by what they had seen and done. This trauma manifested in different ways. Some soldiers became restless, others turned to drink or violence, unable to reconcile their experiences with their civilian lives. Today, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a known and recognized affliction among soldiers, but the psychological effects of war have always been present. The brutal nature of medieval combat, the constant threat of death, and the violence inflicted on both combatants and civilians set the stage for the emotional scars that persist in modern military conflicts. In many ways, the nature of warfare, its strategies, its justifications, and its toll on the human mind has not changed as much as we might think. The tactics may have become more technologically advanced, and the weapons far more deadly, but the fundamental human experience of war remains deeply rooted in its medieval past. Whether it's the siege mentality, the use of religious justification, or the psychological cost of conflict, the lessons of medieval warfare continue to shape the modern battlefield. As we move forward, we'll explore how these memories and lessons of medieval warfare continue to influence the collective consciousness of the world. The deep-seated myths of knights, warriors, and just causes persist in our understanding of conflict today. In the next chapter, we will reflect on the lasting legacy of the medieval warrior, tracing how the archetype of the warrior has evolved, and how its influence still resonates in modern culture and politics. What happens when the brutal truth of a warrior's life is buried beneath layers of myth and legend? How did the medieval soldier, often a harsh and forgotten figure, transform into the iconic hero we remember today? The transformation of the medieval warrior from a mere soldier to a legendary figure, enshrined in myth and culture, is a story of incredible contrast. The men who fought in the bloody, unrelenting battles of the Middle Ages, those who faced death with little fanfare and little recognition, would, over time, become the subject of stories that painted them not as mere soldiers, but as noble heroes, chivalrous knights, and defenders of justice. At the heart of this transformation is the figure of the knight. In reality, medieval knights were often little more than well-armoured warriors, fighting for land, power, or the favour of their lords. Their lives were filled with violence, struggle, and the constant threat of death. But over time, this gritty reality was reshaped by myth-making forces, literature, art, and folklore that created an image of the knight as a noble, almost divine defender of virtue. These mythologized knights were no longer just warriors. They were symbols of courage, honour, and the highest ideals of medieval society. One of the most famous examples of this transformation is the legend of King Arthur. Arthur, the once and future king, was likely based on a real, possibly Welsh warrior, who fought in the 5th and 6th centuries. In the historical context, Arthur would have been just another leader of men, battling for control of land and people. But over the centuries, Arthur's story became enveloped in layers of myth, tales of magical swords, quests for the Holy Grail, and the Noble Round Table. The once bloody and pragmatic world of medieval warfare was distilled into a chivalric ideal, where knights upheld justice and sought to defend the innocent. The grim reality of a warrior's life, where brutal decisions and human suffering were everyday occurrences, was replaced by the image of a hero battling for noble causes. Similarly, the legend of Roland, a knight of Charlemagne's court, became one of the most enduring examples of the medieval warrior's transformation into legend. Roland's story, immortalized in the Times Song of Roland *, depicts him as a paragon of virtue and valor. His final stand against the Saracen forces, where he blows his horn to summon aid only as he faces certain death, is portrayed as an act of ultimate courage and self-sacrifice. The Times Song of Roland paints him as a hero fighting for God and his king, his death symbolizing the very ideals of honor and duty. Yet the reality of Roland's life, if he existed at all, was far less glamorous. The historical Roland would have been a warrior caught in the complex, often brutal politics of medieval Europe. But his story was transformed into a legend, an enduring narrative of heroism that overshadowed the gritty details of his real life. These examples, Arthur, Roland, and other legendary figures, illustrate the process of myth-making that took place over centuries. The historical reality of the medieval warrior, marked by violence, hardship, and often little personal glory, was buried beneath layers of romanticism. Over time, the knight became the quintessential symbol of heroism, noble, self-sacrificing, and committed to justice. This myth-making process was not accidental. It was a deliberate creation, shaped by the cultural needs and desires of later generations who sought to frame war and combat in a more palatable, even inspiring light. This transformation was not only confined to literature. Art and folklore also played significant roles in romanticizing the medieval warrior. Sculptures, paintings, and tapestries often depicted knights in shining armor, their faces serene, their postures noble. The grimness of medieval battles, where death was common and bloodshed frequent, was often glossed over in favor of presenting knights as idealized figures, caught in heroic moments of battle or standing in gleaming armor. The focus on honor and chivalry in these depictions elevated the warrior to a higher status, making him not just a soldier, but a symbol of virtue and bravery. The contrast between the real warrior and the mythic hero would have profound implications on how warfare and heroism were perceived in later centuries. The idealized image of the knight influenced the way subsequent generations viewed military service. The idea of fighting for a noble cause, of defending one's homeland, became wrapped in the notion of heroism that was birthed from these medieval myths. Today, when we think of military heroes, we often invoke the same ideals that were first attributed to figures like King Arthur and Roland: courage, self-sacrifice, and a sense of duty to something larger than oneself. But the question remains: what happens when the brutal truth of a warrior's life is buried beneath the weight of legend? In modern times, we often find ourselves drawn to these larger-than-life figures, seeking to understand war and heroism through the lens of myth. The harsh realities of combat, the trauma, the loss, the moral ambiguity, are often overshadowed by the idealized notion of the warrior as a flawless hero. And yet, behind these myths, the truth of the medieval soldier's life still lingers, a reminder of the human cost of war. As we move forward, we'll explore how the myth of the medieval warrior continues to shape our modern understanding of war and heroism. From the stories we tell to the heroes we venerate, the legacy of the medieval knight is alive and well in contemporary culture. It's here that we begin to see how the myths we've built around these figures have influenced our perceptions of combat, shaping our expectations of those who fight today. Why does the medieval warrior still capture our imagination, centuries after the last battle was fought? How have the tales of knights, kings, and legendary warriors shaped the way we view war today? The answer lies in the enduring power of the stories that were created in the Middle Ages, stories that have been passed down through generations, evolving but never losing their fundamental appeal. The archetypes of the knight, the warrior, and the hero continue to resonate in modern storytelling, weaving their way through films, books, and games, shaping how we understand honor, courage, and battle. At the heart of this cultural memory is the enduring image of the knight. Medieval knights were more than just soldiers. They were symbols of idealized values, and those values are still central to the way we think about heroism today. These knights, as we see in stories of King Arthur, Roland, and countless other legendary figures, were not only warriors, they were men of honor, fighting for noble causes, often against overwhelming odds. This image of the knight, struggling for justice and fighting with both valor and chivalry, has persisted in modern culture, influencing the way we view military service, personal sacrifice, and the pursuit of higher ideals. In contemporary media, the medieval warrior is alive and well. Epic fantasies like The Lord of the Rings times draw heavily from the traditions of medieval legend. Characters such as Aragorn, with his noble lineage and warrior ethos, are direct descendants of the Knights of the Round Table. These characters embody the same virtues of honour, bravery, and duty that medieval knights did, while facing challenges that seem both timeless and universal. The battle scenes, filled with grand armies, heroic duels, and the clash of swords, are reminiscent of the medieval warfare that shaped the myths and legends we cherish. Yet, in modern retellings, these ancient stories are adapted for contemporary sensibilities, balancing the brutality of war with a sense of moral clarity that often feels more aligned with modern ideals of heroism. This archetype of the warrior also thrives in the world of video games. Franchises like Assassin's Creed, and The Witcher take players back to the Middle Ages, immersing them in worlds filled with knights, mercenaries, and battles for power. In these games, the player takes on the role of a warrior, making choices that reflect the complex moral and ethical landscape similar to those found in medieval combat. Assassin's Creed specifically draws from the historical backdrop of the Crusades, allowing players to explore the motivations and struggles of those who fought in these wars. While the historical accuracy may vary, the core themes of honour, loyalty, and the warrior spirit resonate deeply with players, just as they did with the knights of old. These stories allow us to engage with the medieval past in a visceral way, embodying the same ideals that shaped the warriors of history. The continued fascination with medieval warfare in modern storytelling also points to a larger cultural phenomenon. The archetypes of the medieval warrior still speak to something universal in the human experience: honour, courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. These are timeless qualities that transcend the specific historical context of the Middle Ages. The knight, with his sense of duty to something greater than himself, represents a longing for a simpler, more straightforward sense of purpose in an increasingly complex world. The struggle between good and evil, embodied in the epic battles of medieval tales, remains a powerful narrative framework that continues to dominate storytelling today. Yet, despite the romanticization of medieval warriors in modern media, there remains a shadowy truth about the nature of war that is sometimes hidden beneath the idealized depictions of battle. In The Lord of the Rings for example, the battles are glorious, but they also come at great cost. Characters like Aragorn and Frodo bear the emotional weight of their wars, and even in the end, the triumph of good over evil is tinged with loss and sacrifice. Modern depictions of medieval warriors, whether in film, literature, or games, often balance the romantic allure of battle with an acknowledgement of its destructive consequences. This complexity mirrors the way medieval warriors themselves might have grappled with the violence and moral challenges of their time. In examining how medieval warfare shapes modern storytelling, we see that these age-old myths continue to influence our views on heroism, violence, and the human cost of war. The stories of knights, kings, and legendary warriors are not just historical curiosities, they are foundational narratives that shape how we approach conflict today. Whether in the realms of fantasy, historical fiction, or interactive media, the ideals of the medieval warrior remain alive, continuing to captivate our imaginations and challenge our understanding of what it means to fight for a cause greater than oneself. As we conclude our discussion on the cultural memory of medieval warfare, we will turn our attention to the lessons that these ancient stories offer. The legacy of the medieval warrior is more than just an abstract myth. It has tangible effects on how we view war, heroism, and leadership in the modern world. In the final section of this chapter, we will reflect on how the memory of medieval warfare continues to shape contemporary society and global conflicts, leaving a lasting imprint on our collective consciousness. What lessons can we learn from the blood-stained fields of the past? As we face new wars, what must we remember about the mistakes of our medieval ancestors? The legacy of medieval warfare is a story filled with tragedy, triumph, and a wealth of hard-earned lessons. These lessons, though centuries old, continue to echo through modern conflicts, offering both cautionary tales and guidance as we navigate the complexities of contemporary warfare. By reflecting on the strategies, mistakes, and consequences of medieval warfare, we can uncover insights that remain as relevant today as they were during the Middle Ages. One of the most significant lessons from medieval warfare is the devastating cost of unchecked ambition. Throughout the Middle Ages, kings and commanders often pursued territorial expansion or personal glory at the expense of their people, leading to endless cycles of violence and suffering. The 100 Years' War, for instance, was not just a conflict between England and France. It was a prolonged power struggle fueled by a mix of dynastic claims, nationalism, and political manipulation. The war dragged on for over a century, devastating both nations, and leaving a legacy of economic ruin, loss of life, and deep-rooted animosity that would persist for generations. This relentless pursuit of power at the cost of human lives serves as a stark reminder of the importance of diplomacy and restraint in modern conflicts. Today, as nations grapple with territorial disputes or ideological differences, the consequences of unchecked ambition should serve as a warning against allowing conflicts to spiral into protracted wars with no clear end in sight. Another key lesson is the importance of understanding the human cost of war. Medieval warfare, with its brutal tactics and often indiscriminate violence, was a stark reminder of the toll that war takes on both soldiers and civilians. The horrors of sieges, the brutality of hand-to-hand combat, and the destruction of entire cities all left deep scars on the collective psyche of the medieval world. Yet, despite these grim realities, many medieval commanders and rulers seem to prioritize victory above all else, often sacrificing the lives of their soldiers and subjects for the sake of their ambitions. Today, as we witness modern conflicts, many of which are fought in densely populated urban areas or involve non-state actors, the human cost of warfare must remain at the forefront of our decision-making. The mistakes of medieval leaders, who failed to weigh the long-term consequences of their military actions, serve as a reminder that war should always be a last resort, and the protection of civilians must be a central concern in any conflict. The psychological effects of war, too, offer critical lessons. In the Middle Ages, warriors were often glorified in legend, celebrated for their courage and sacrifice, but the psychological toll of combat was rarely acknowledged. The trauma experienced by soldiers, from the emotional scars of violence to the physical toll of prolonged battle, was often hidden beneath the myth of the noble warrior. Modern warfare, with its emphasis on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and the mental health of veterans, has finally begun to acknowledge the deep psychological wounds inflicted by combat. Yet, the lessons of medieval soldiers who often returned from battle broken, only to face further battles at home, remind us of the importance of providing mental health care and support for soldiers returning from war. As our understanding of the psychological effects of warfare deepens, we must ensure that we prioritize the well-being of those who serve, recognizing the invisible wounds that often follow them back from the front lines. Perhaps the most crucial lesson we can draw from the medieval period is the need for unity and purpose in war. The fractious nature of medieval Europe, with its countless warring kingdoms, rival factions, and shifting alliances, often led to a lack of cohesion on the battlefield. Military success in the Middle Ages was often dependent on the ability of commanders to unite diverse forces under a common cause. Yet, the lack of unity, whether due to competing interests, lack of coordination, or unclear objectives, often doomed military campaigns before they even began. In modern conflicts, the need for clear objectives, unified strategies, and cooperation between nations and allies remains as crucial as ever. The disunity that plagued medieval warfare offers a cautionary tale. Without a shared vision and strong cooperation, victory can slip through even the most powerful hands. In closing, the legacy of medieval warfare is more than just a collection of battles and strategies. It is a reflection of the human experience in conflict. The stories of knights and kings, soldiers and peasants, are reminders of the horrors of war and the profound impact it has on both individuals and societies. By studying the mistakes and triumphs of our medieval ancestors, we gain valuable insights into how we can approach modern conflicts with more wisdom, compassion, and foresight. The bloodshed of the past has much to teach us, not only about the nature of warfare, but about the human condition itself. As we face the challenges of the future, we must remember the lessons of the Middle Ages, the importance of diplomacy, the protection of civilians, the care of soldiers, and the need for unity in the pursuit of peace. With these reflections, we conclude our journey through the story of medieval warfare. The past, though distant, continues to shape the present, reminding us that the legacy of those who fought before us still holds lessons for those who fight today. As we move forward, we carry these lessons not as burdens, but as guides, reminders of what has been and what must never be repeated.